Everybody, we're here for the next presentation by Ian Rose. Ian is a software engineer, data scientist, and geophysicist, and a software engineer at Coiled, and has been a Project Jupyter developer, a data scientist in local government, and a Dask contributor. Ian, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Jim. Welcome. Today I will be talking about the Dask JupyterLab extension. A little bit about me. As stated, I am currently a software engineer at Coiled. At various times in the past, I've been a geophysicist, a Project Jupyter contributor, a data scientist in government, and I'm also one of the maintainers and authors of the Dask JupyterLab extension. The Dask JupyterLab extension sort of grew out of some collaborations between at the time I was working at UC Berkeley, and we were collaborating with the Pangeo team, the Pangeo folks, which have been all over this conference, and also with Matt Rocklin with the Dask team. And we found that there were a number of pain points that were that users of Jupyter notebooks were experiencing when working with Dask. There was a lot of copying and pasting of URLs around. When the Dask stands up its dashboard, there's a URL to that dashboard. People typically would have to open up a new browser window. They would have to shuffle browser windows around. It was generally pretty awkward. When the clusters were stood up, it was generally kind of tricky to connect to existing ones. Again, a lot of URLs being passed around. And also, a lot of the times, we didn't want to impose on students or new users the responsibility and sort of trickiness of standing up a new cluster. We wanted to make it easy to for them to both A, spin up a cluster, and B, connect to existing clusters without really having to think about deployment too much. So also around that time, I was working with the JupyterLab team, and JupyterLab is, for people who haven't used it yet, it is a next generation iteration on the Jupyter Notebook interface. So for a while, Jupyter Notebooks had the ability to do things like open terminals and text files and such, but they weren't really very integrated into the user experience. They were often hidden. People didn't really know where to find them. There were also a lot of extensions that had very organically grown up around the Jupyter Notebook interface, but these extensions were using sort of semi-private APIs. There was very little API stability. So the JupyterLab project was an attempt to basically solve these problems by having first-class support for extensions and having very well sort of spec'd and documented APIs for extension authors to create their own extensions and components that can be added to the Jupyter Notebook interface. So when we do this, we really mean, when we say first-class support for extensions, we really mean it. Every part of the JupyterLab user interface is itself an extension. So notebooks are an extension, terminals are an extension, the menu system is an extension. And so when one is developing and deploying a JupyterLab extension, it really is sitting on equal footing with the rest of the user interface. So this was a good opportunity to sort of prove out some of these ideas with JupyterLab. And one thing I did want to, one sort of recent development I did want to flag is that as of JupyterLab 3, so previously installing a new extension in JupyterLab was sort of a laborious process. You needed to have Node installed on your system. It could take 60 to 90 seconds. It was kind of painful. As of JupyterLab 3, it has actually become very easy to pip or conda install extensions. It's fast. You don't have to know anything about JavaScript. And that's largely due to the heroic efforts of Steve Sylvester, who's currently at Apple. So if you have tried out the Dask Lab extension before, found it kind of a pain to install, give it another shot. So at this point, I'm going to move over to a demo. Can people still see my screen?
Yep, looking good.
I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yep.
Okay. So here is JupyterLab. I've got a notebook open. On the left here, you can see there's this panel, which is the user interface for the Dask JupyterLab extension. It gets slotted in on the left side here with a little Dask logo. There are two components to it. There's this thing on top, which is the Dask dashboard launcher. It allows you to launch various components of the Dask dashboard into the JupyterLab work area. You can see that it currently doesn't do anything because I don't have any Dask clusters linked to it. And then down here, there's a cluster manager. This allows you to start, stop, scale various clusters. It can be configured to launch any of a number of different kinds of Dask clusters, and is in some circumstances a nice way to do that, but it doesn't work in all circumstances, and I'll circle back to that later. But I'm going to start out by launching a new Dask cluster by clicking this button here. And what this has done is it's spun up a Dask cluster. This is currently just a local cluster, so it's running on my laptop. And at the same time, it's automatically put the URL to the Dask dashboard in this URL bar here, and you can see that the various buttons have lit up. For instance, if I now click on, say, the task stream button, I get the Dask task stream dashboard, and I can move this over here, and maybe I will also open up task graph and say put this here, and maybe also open up let's say the cluster map's kind of fun, and put this here. And so I'm free to just sort of decide which of these dashboards are most relevant and useful to whatever task I have at hand, and pop them out into my work area and array them in any way that I find useful. So I've created this cluster, but I haven't actually connected to it in my notebook here. So what I can actually do is, and this is a feature that I think not many people, I haven't documented particularly well, but I should be able to click and drag this cluster into my notebook. And what it does is it pops in the relevant code snippet to actually connect to this cluster. And so if I execute this, now I have a client ready to go, and I can start submitting computations to this cluster. Okay, so what I have here is a very simple X-array workflow. I'm constructing a lazy data set, and then when I call compute, I should actually start seeing these task graphs. All right, so the Dask Lab extension, if it only worked with local clusters, that would be maybe nice for demos, but not particularly useful for work, at least scalable work. And so we would also like it to work on larger clusters. And so to that end, we can also connect to other clusters. So what I'm going to do here is connect to a coiled cluster. So I've got a cluster which I've named demo. It has 10 workers running on AWS, and now I have a new client which is connected to this coiled cluster. But this new client, or the Dask Lab extension, doesn't actually know anything about this new client. So what I can do is click on this magnifying glass icon, and what that does is it goes to your notebook and tries to pull out the information about whatever current client you have, and pop the dashboard URL into the extension. And so hopefully when I click on this, we should get, you can see the URL changed, and now we have, and these dashboard panels have refreshed, and now it's actually pointed at a completely different Dask cluster that's running in AWS right now. And so now if I run this quick start workflow, we should see, and this is just a a basic workflow using the New York taxi dataset that everyone uses ad nauseum. We should see again this spring to life, but now it's running on tens of gigabytes of data on the cloud instead of on my local laptop. I'll wait for this to finish. All right, and we're done. Okay, so this is pretty much where the Dask Lab extension stands today. There's a couple other things that I haven't shown. I can, for instance, try to scale my clusters by clicking in this button. I also have the ability to shut them down, so I'll do that cleanup after myself a little bit. But otherwise, I'm going to pop back to my presentation. All right. So that's basically where we are, and I have a lot of time left. So what I want to do now is start is to sort of go into where the Dask Lab extension has not been particularly successful and where there are opportunities for new contributors, both for people on the Python side and on the JavaScript side, to contribute features. So if anybody is interested, please do reach out to me. I think that there are some fairly impactful things we can do in the short and medium term to make this this extension work better for more people. So first off, I took a flip the other day through various Dask sister projects and came up with a bunch of projects that do cluster management. And so first off, we have the Dask JupyterLab extension, which right in the README it says it manages Dask clusters. That's the launch new cluster thing that I showed a few minutes ago. We also have the Dask Gateway project, which manages Dask clusters. There's a new project from Jacob Tomlinson, which as you can see right here, it says it manages Dask clusters. So these are not the same project, but they're like they all do different things. They're all worthwhile projects, but there is a certain amount of duplication of effort when it comes to managing Dask clusters. And so the question that I would like to solve in the sort of medium term here is how do we rationalize the concept of cluster management so that we're not really duplicating similar logic in lots of sister Dask projects? Or to put it another way, I would really like to delete Dask Lab Extension's cluster manager and put that logic into and sort of consolidate that logic somewhere else. And so I have some ideas about how to do this. Jacob Tomlinson has some ideas about how to do this. If you're interested, please do engage with us. Next up, the workflow that I showed works very well in a universe where there isn't a lot of authentication. So like if I, for instance, am running a Dask cluster on my if I'm running a Dask cluster locally, then it's just running on localhost. It's fairly easy to establish a connection to that. There are some projects like Dask Gateway, which handle authentication and proxying of Dask connections for you, but there are still lots of situations in which connecting to an existing Dask cluster will fail because it requires some level of authentication. So when I click and dragged the cluster connection information, I got something like this, which is where we had a connection to localhost. In that case, it worked fine. But if I had a connection had a connection to a Dask cluster that was protected by SSL, that would have failed. When I'm trying to connect to a Dask URL or to the dashboard URL, if that dashboard is available on localhost or is proxied in some way, that will work. But if that dashboard is hidden behind some sort of authenticated service, as might be the case if, for instance, you have a Jupyter Hub, or if you're using something like a managed cloud service like Coiled, you might actually have some trouble viewing that dashboard. And that's because that dashboard is behind authentication, and the Dask Lab extension doesn't know anything about authentication. So we would like to add some extensibility to the Dask Lab extension so that different cluster providers can say, oh, hey, I know how to authenticate to this service and handle all that so that it will work better with this type of workflow. And again, I have an issue open for this. If you're interested in engaging on that, please do. Or if you have a deployment that you would like to work with this and want to sort of weigh in on your particular use case, I'd be very interested to hear about that. Another thing that would be very helpful if somebody wanted to do is custom cluster configuration. So when I launched my local cluster, I had it configured to launch a local cluster. That's fairly easy to do. But let's say I was trying to customize it and launch a different kind of cluster. The current workflow for doing that is we put this config in a YAML file in our config directory that describes how to launch the cluster using the Dask Lab extension. This file is read by the extension, and it uses that to launch new clusters. This is the workflow for trying to create or trying to edit the various cluster configs. You can see that it's kind of laborious, and what would be nice is if we could build a user interface, some sort of form that pops up on the front end where it allows you to, for instance, edit some YAML and then have that show up immediately. So this is a nice opportunity for somebody who has some HTML and JavaScript skills to come in and create a nicer UI for this workflow. Finally, I wanted to say, like, you know, we've created this front end for the Dask Lab extension. Not every component of it is useful to every person. So there's a lot of individual dashboard panels here. Some of them might not be interesting or relevant to your particular deployment. We could make it customizable so that we can, you know, remove some of these panels. Other people are completely not interested in this cluster management, especially if it doesn't work for their particular use case. And, you know, we're trying to fix that. But if it doesn't and won't work for your use case, maybe you just want to hide this. And so there's opportunities to make this more flexible and customizable. Okay, so at the beginning of this talk, I highlighted some of the pain points that people use, or that people run into when they're using Dask in a Jupyter Notebook setting. And I wanted to circle back to this and sort of see how we did with the Dask Lab extension. So people were copying and pasting URLs a lot. How do we do? Well, I think we got partial credit. There are some workflows for which this works very well, but there are other workflows for which it doesn't work well. And we have ways that we're trying to deal with that with authentication and with some better ideas around cluster management, but we're not quite there yet. If your cluster does work with the Dask Lab extension, then I think we've done a pretty good job of not having you have to like click around various browser windows. You can pop out all the relevant, all of the Dask dashboard panes and arrange them however you like, and I think that pretty much works today. The problem of connecting to existing long-lived clusters, again, I think we have partial credit. Depending upon your specific deployment and authentication setup, this will or won't work, and we would like to make it work better. And finally, again, I think we have partial credit on deploying custom cluster config to students or other users. It works in some settings, but not in other settings. We can do better. So that's basically what I have. I see I'm doing great on time. So I would like to thank my co-maintainers. That's Matt Rockland, Julia Signal, and Jacob Tomlinson. We've been supported by the various companies that we all have worked at, as well as the Morris Sloan Foundation and UC Berkeley. And I have lots of time for questions or comments if anybody has any.
Great. We do have a couple of questions, so let's do that. We have one question. Sometimes I restart my kernel before I remember to close the cluster, and I worry that maybe I have ghost clusters lingering around. How can I view all the clusters I've opened? Will they all show up on the Dask tab?
So this I think comes back to this question of discovery. So as it is right now, we don't have a good way to, let's see, where is the slide for this? We don't really have a good way, at least using the Dask Lab extension, we don't have a good way to list pre-existing clusters. So the Dask Lab extension currently really only knows about clusters that it itself has launched. And so if, for instance, you kill your notebook server and restart it, that information is gone. It's not really stored anywhere. I think one possible solution to this is to use a project like Dask Control. This is a new project which has a built-in entry points based method for discovering existing Dask clusters. If we do it and wind up adopting this, then I think that would be a solution to your problem. But right now, I think there isn't really a good answer, but we'd like to fix
that. From about 10 minutes ago, we had someone asking what are red lines?
In the dashboard? Let's see.
Yeah, this person wants to maybe put in the chat a little more context. What was going on at that time? In the meantime, let me ask you a different question. As a new Dask user, I'm using the Summit to evaluate Dask for my research group. Looks to me that I could create an experiment management system in Jupyter Hub. Am I wrong?
I do not think you're wrong. A number of research groups run custom Jupyter Hubs. You know, some of them do it on a sort of cloud-based system like Kubernetes, but also some of them just stand one up on a beefy machine they have sitting under somebody's desk, and they find that works pretty well for them. And the Dask Lab extension will work in both cases.
And then to follow up to that last question, the answer is yes. In the dashboard, red seems bad. Was the comment?
Are we talking about this? I'm not sure. This dashboard pane appears to have gotten stuck, but I believe that's communication between the various nodes.
Any other questions? We can always continue on Slack as well. Ian, if you're available to hang around Slack for a little bit.
I am, yeah.
A couple more minutes if someone else has a question here. But if not, I appreciate the talk. Thank you very much. We did get one more question. Awesome. Speaking of security, the dashboard link before is open to everyone on the web right now. You might want to close that and put behind back at some point. VPC clarification.
Yeah, this comes back to the authentication that we want to teach the Dask Lab extension about.